Hi, my name is Chip Tarbutton. I'm president of the Roanoke Tea Party, and this is the second video in our series, The Definition of Insanity. This one speaks specifically to not standing up for the 10th Amendment. The whole premise of this presentation, or these presentations, was really this quote by Albert Einstein that said, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Well, we talked about in our first presentation the fact that we keep sending incumbents back to Washington, and then we're shocked and appalled when they keep making the same mistakes over and over again. And how we break that cycle is getting rid of the incumbents. Well, we keep complaining about the federal government overreaching and doing things they don't have the constitutional authority to do, and we expect the federal government to somehow stop itself from doing it. That's also just as crazy as expecting incumbents to change things in Washington. How many ways does the federal government really overreach? Well, here's just a really short list. Obamacare, energy policy, environmental policy, education policies. That's just a few. We're just dipping our toe into the water here. But does anyone seriously think the federal government is going to start making laws on these things of their own accord? Of course not. But what about the 10th Amendment? Who's going to make the government abide by the 10th Amendment? There's this 10th Amendment that says, if it's not delegated to the federal government, the states should be doing it. That's true, but somebody's got to enforce the law, and it's certainly not going to be the courts. I mean, did it help to have a Republican Supreme Court Chief Justice for the Obamacare ruling? No. Is the federal legislature going to do anything? I mean, a Republican Congress couldn't even follow through and get rid of the Department of Education, which they promised to do back in the 90s. And in fact, just a few years after that, they expanded it with No Child Left Behind. And then, of course, there's the executive branch. Well, that's not going to happen. Obviously, we know President Obama will take any opportunity to expand his power in any way he can. But he's just following the footsteps of other presidents. He's not the first one to do it. He's just a lot better at it than other presidents have been in the past. But presidents back to Roosevelt, and I'm talking about the Teddy Roosevelt, not the FDR Roosevelt, have been doing this and taking baby steps to the sort of royal executive branch that we're turning into today, which is, of course, anathema to the spirit and the letter of the Constitution. So if the 10th Amendment protects the rights of the states and the people, who's going to step up and make sure the 10th Amendment is followed? Well, if it protects the states and the people, it obviously is going to be up to the states and the people to stand up for the 10th Amendment. We need leaders, and we know the current leadership won't lead. People are afraid. Leadership in the GOP was afraid to stand up and talk seriously about nullification and standing up to the federal government because it would be unpopular and they get ridiculed by the press and so on and so forth. But if we continue on this current path where the federal government keeps regulating and regulating and regulating things that they don't have power to do, we're doomed. So if we continue down this path, that's the definition of insanity. We've got to do something different. And the Roanoke Tea Party, we do have a plan, and we do need your help. And that plan really revolves around nullification. So our Roanoke Tea Party Freedom Plan for 2013 at the state level really talks about taking power from the federal government and putting it back in the rightful place, which would be the states. Now, just because the state has the power doesn't mean they're going to do it right. And just because the state has the power to do something doesn't mean they should do something. But the first step in returning sanity to this nation is allowing the states to do their job and taking the power away from the federal government. Now, nullification and interposition is a tool to do that. But not surprisingly, this controversial idea is not real popular with current officials in Richmond, who either say they don't know anything about it or will tell you that it's a horrible idea and it's all about secession and slavery and Jim Crow and so on and so forth. Now, remember that the first rule of politics is get elected and stay elected. And if you remember nothing else from these presentations, remember that the first rule of politics is to get elected and to stay elected. Elected officials won't support real nullification until their jobs depend on it, and that's not going to happen until there are thousands of people pushing for it. And if then the politicians won't do it, then we have to find new candidates who support nullification and interposition. So what is nullification? It's a word that people know but don't really understand. It is developed by two people you may have heard of. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. They developed this because the feds were out of control. Their states wanted to resist, and the other states didn't. Sound familiar? What's happening today? If it was good enough for the authors of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, then maybe we should be paying attention. Now, in concert with the 10th Amendment Center, which is a national group that we're partnering with, we're going to be going across the state and educating people and starting this groundswell of movement for nullification. But really quickly, I wanted to give you sort of a one-on-one class on nullification. The Constitution lays out exactly the role of the federal government. They're called the enumerated powers. Article 1, Section 8, Pledge Pocket Constitution. Check it out. There's a whole to-do list for the federal government listed in Article 1, Section 8. If the Constitution doesn't designate the powers of the federal government, either there or in an amendment later on, the states and the people have those rights. And that's redefined even clear by the 9th and the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, which were ratified as part of the Bill of Rights. There's been several famous cases in farther in history. We have the case that started it all, the Sedition Act, which is where James Madison and Thomas Jefferson were fighting against, which basically invalidated the First Amendment and made it illegal to criticize the government. That happened 13 years after the ratification of the Constitution. So it didn't take very long for the federal government to start overreaching and trying to pass unconstitutional laws. Government always tries to push its power, as the government does, and that's why the founders tried to create limited powers, because they knew people would or are innately incapable of ruling for a long time without being corrupted. And that's just why they did it the way they did it. We have the case of Joshua Glover and Sherman Booth, which is probably my favorite case of nullification, where Wisconsin nullified the Fugitive Slave Act. Basically, Sherman Booth was an abolitionist. Joshua Glover was an escaped slave. Joshua Glover's slave owner came to Wisconsin to reclaim his property, and there was a Fugitive Slave Act, which was constitutional, which allowed forced the federal government to interpose itself and to help the slave owner bring the slave back home. Well, Sherman Booth thought that was an unconstitutional idea, so do I, and he broke him out of jail, got Joshua Glover out with a mob of 3,000 people that basically broke him out of jail and spirited Joshua Glover to freedom in Canada. Sherman Booth was then, going to be prosecuted by the feds. Wisconsin wouldn't allow it to happen. Their state legislature and their judiciary stepped in and protected Sherman Booth for doing the right thing, and they fought with the federal government all the way up to the Civil War, where the case became basically moot. Now, modern nullification, this isn't old stuff. There's been cases of effective nullification. A few of them are written here. I'll focus on a couple. The most successful one in Virginia has been Real ID. The federal law right now mandates that you have a federal ID card. You're probably not carrying a federal ID card. It's never been put in the law because states like Virginia nullified the federal action, and that was done by both Democrats and Republicans. So it can be done. This is not a right or left issue as much as it is a constitutional issue. I mentioned medical marijuana here and marijuana laws in general. Not to say that I'm in support of medical marijuana or legalizing marijuana, but all I'm saying is the federal government does not have the constitutional power to enforce federal marijuana laws. They're unconstitutional. Now, that's not to say that it's a good idea. Just because a law is constitutional doesn't necessarily mean it's good. So, but it's up to each state to decide those things. And very conservative states like Alabama have stood at the side of these more liberal states to try and push for their right to nullify things like medical marijuana laws. And there's been a number of other acts that have taken place. So your state legislatures, and it's not just Democrat or Republican, it's constitutional issues, and it cuts across both ways. Getting back to the original nullification actions, the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, the underlying premise that all of the nullification actions are based on is that an unconstitutional law is void. If that is true, who else can protect the people but the states? Are we to believe that the founders made no serious provision for the states to protect themselves from the catastrophic decisions by the federal government? Well, they didn't specifically, but when that started to happen so quickly, both Jefferson and Madison stepped in and just developed the procedure for doing that, which is nullification. There's common criticism of nullification that you'll hear from the left primarily, but for others as well. One is the Supreme Court decides this stuff. Well, it doesn't really say that in the Constitution. The Supreme Court has given itself that power, but it's not given in the Constitution. So again, the Supreme Court should be ruling on the supremacy of things when it's an enumerated power. If there's a dispute between the states and the federal government, the states created the federal government. It's ridiculous to think that the federal government would somehow have proxy over the states, who are the founders of this institution, and be able to impose their will upon it. That's sort of saying that the employer is subject to the whim of the employee. That doesn't really happen, shouldn't happen. Now, the other one is the General Welfare Clause. It's what the concept of welfare was based on. The fact that the Constitution allows the federal government to promote the general welfare. Well, if you read any of the Federalist Papers, you'll realize that this was a big topic, and the Federalists all said the General Welfare Clause, including Madison, because he wrote the Federalist Papers and realized what had happened and came up with the concept of nullification. When he did this, they realized that it only applies to the enumerated powers. And the Anti-Federalists pushed and pushed, and eventually they gave in and said, okay, well, fine, we'll put the 10th Amendment in there, which further clarifies that the federal government's powers are specifically limited to the enumerated powers. The Anti-Federalists still said it wasn't enough, and they were right. And Madison soon came to realize that the Anti-Federalists were right on this charge, which led him to write the nullification action in Virginia in the late 1700s and early 1800s. The Supremacy Clause. The Constitution says that constitutional law shall be the supreme law of the land. However, the Supremacy Clause does not say that unconstitutional laws are the supreme law of the land. If the federal government does not have the enumerated power to regulate something, then laws passed in regards to those issues are inherently unconstitutional. Yet time and time again you'll hear people say, well, the federal government is supreme. Well, not on things they don't have the power to do. That's a silly argument. Nullification supported slavery. You hear that one on MSNBC. Rachel Maddow will spew that out and talk about the nullification crisis of 1832. That was primarily about tariffs. It wasn't about slavery. There was no need to nullify slavery because slavery was considered constitutional prior to the Civil War. In fact, South Carolina listed nullification as one of their grievances when they seceded from the Union. They got tired of states like Wisconsin nullifying the Fugitive Slave Act. So it's a patently ridiculous argument. There is one valid criticism of nullification, and that's the southern states did try to nullify anti-segregation laws in the 1950s. The federal government rightly stepped in because the role of any government is to protect the rights of the people. And when those rights were being infringed by Jim Crow laws, the federal government rightly stepped in to protect the rights of the people. But the federal government had the right and the duty to do that. The state governments now have the right and the duty to protect the citizens from unconstitutional and oppressive laws from the federal government. And that's what we're talking about here. Nullification really is the civil rights movement of the 21st century. Last few general words on nullification. Without interposition, without the state stepping in and actively doing it, it's like a car without gasoline. It doesn't really do you any good. And there's a number of bills in front of the General Assembly in the 2013 session that are kind of like that. They just say, hey, we believe in the 10th Amendment. Well, that's great, but what are you going to do to protect us when they violate the 10th Amendment? And it's moot there. So we need stronger action by the states other than just saying that we support the 10th Amendment. And lastly, sheriffs and juries can also nullify unconstitutional actions. Sheriffs can say that's not a constitutional law, and we're not going to let you enforce it in my county. Same thing for juries. They can find somebody innocent or not, award something based on the fact that a law or procedure violates the Constitution. So, from a state perspective, we're partnering with the 10th Amendment Center to do presentations across the state on nullification. Pushing a set of legislative initiatives with the 10th Amendment Center that we need a sponsor for. So we need a lot of pressure on state legislators to get behind the concept of nullification and interposition. We need to market nullification, starting with a Nullify Now or Tour Stop, hopefully in Roanoke, Virginia in the near future. But it's not going to work unless there's a groundswell of popular support for the idea, because again, the bottom line is in American politics, getting elected and staying elected is all that matters to officials. So we need to make sure that staying elected means supporting nullification. So what can you do? Donate your time, donate your money. we need help to promote this. It's something that we've got some expertise in doing. We've got the people to do the promotion, but we need time and money and a wider audience, because if there's not a groundswell of support, nullification is just going to be a good idea that's going to be bandied around in right-wing circles and not really get anywhere. We need to talk to groups. If there's a group that's an advocacy group for an issue, if it's in violation of the federal constitution, we can talk about nullification, specific nullification actions for those things. And lastly, our legislative agenda as a Tea Party is really nullify it. That's what we're really going to be pushing for almost solely in Richmond in this year and in coming years. Now, GOP leadership will generally actively oppose this because it looks too conservative. Because conservatism looks dangerous to career politicians in Richmond as well as Washington, because it violates the two rules of getting elected and staying elected. So what specifically to do? Sign up to help, donate money, join the Roanoke Tea Party as a voting member. Remember, it wasn't nullification that got Joshua Glover out of prison. It was a group of 3,000 Wisconsin patriots that freed Joshua Glover. And it wasn't nullification that protected Sherman Booth. It was courageous legislators and judges who were persuaded by those 3,000 Wisconsin patriots to do the right thing. And it wasn't any legal principle in Virginia that got the Health Care Freedom Act passed in 2010. It was 3,000 patriots that showed up in Richmond and voiced their opposition to Obamacare that scared enough state legislators into doing the right thing. Change won't happen unless we make it happen. We can't stick back and wait for things to happen. We've got to make them happen. And one of my favorite historical figures is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a pastor in Nazi Germany who actively worked to save Jews from the Holocaust. And he has some great quotes, and I love this one. It talks about the fact that it's not enough to just bandage the wounds of victims, but we need to drive a spoke into the wheels of injustice. And that's the tool that nullification allows us to do against the federal government. And we're not going to do that unless we actively make it happen. I'll leave last quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and that is, "Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak, not to act is to act." So if you're sitting on your couch and you think there's nothing you can do, there is. It's called nullification, interposition, and you need to talk to your state legislator today, and you need to join the Roanoke Tea Party at roanoketeaparty.com. And help us in this fight. My name is Chip Tarbudden. I'll hope to see you at our next meeting, which will be the second Thursday of the month, which will be January 3rd. And again, Nullify Now. We appreciate your time. Have a great day.